In this video, we're going to talk about Java FileIO. You can find information about Java FileIO in a number of places. If you go to my lecture notes and you go to Brad's Cliff Notes, you will find some information by scrolling down on FileIO. That basically is just a summary. You can also go to Java.io, the tutorial, and you will see a tutorial feature on FileIO. And finally, you can go to my example code and look at the example using FileIO, which is something that we'll be going over at the end of this video. So here's the things you need to know about FileIO in Java. First thing that you need to know is that all file classes or FileIO classes are contained in the Java.io library. And so at the beginning of your program, you're going to have to say import java.io.star. And the .star says import all files from java.io, or you could be specific. You could say import java.io.fileReader or whatever other classes you need, but it gets tiresome, hence I just say java.io.star. So that's number one. Number two, you are going to have to worry about I/O exceptions with FileIO. And for the time being, we're not going to handle them. But if you're not going to handle a file exception, then you're going to have to say that your method throws it. So you're going to see me doing something like, say, static public void main ... right after it throws I/O exception. And that means I'm not handling the I/O exception in main, and I expect some other method to handle it. Now in this case, there is nothing above main, so the I/O exception gets thrown to the virtual machine, and the virtual machine will print out an appropriate message associated with the exception. We'll show that in a bit when I'll try to open a file that doesn't exist. So, next thing we're going to talk about is how you actually read from a file and write from a file. So first let's talk about file input. And there's three classes that you care about with file input. The first one is the file reader class, and that is the class that actually opens a file for input. So you give it a file name as a string, and you can give it a full path name if you want. It'll return a file reader object. Now you don't want to read directly from a file reader. You really want to buffer the input so that it's done efficiently. So what you're really going to want to do is create a buffered reader and drop the file reader object that you created into this buffered reader. And you now have an option, once you have the buffered reader, of either reading lines from the buffered reader or further dropping the buffer reader into a scanner object. So the reason for dropping the buffered reader into a scanner object is so that you could use stream I/O. That is, you could read it one token at a time. So if you want to do line-oriented I/O, use a buffered reader. If you want to use stream I/O, where you read a token at a time, use a scanner. And with a scanner, remember, you'll also have to import it from java.util. Okay. Now, associated with the buffered reader, let's go down here. You've already seen this scanner class, but associated with the buffered reader is three important methods. So first is readLine. It returns a string, and you can drop that string into a scanner object to tokenize it. Then you can test for end of file using ready. So if ready returns true, you have another line. False, and it means you've reached EOF. And the final thing is the close method. You want to close when you're done using a buffered reader. It will automatically close the file reader as well. Just as a quick example of doing FileIO, we've set up a file here that looks much like the one from the scanner video. So we have a variable input reader, that's scanner, and we're simply going to read a stream of tokens, and we're assuming their ages. So you'll see how I set it up here. I first created a file reader given a input from the command line, wrapped that file reader in a buffered reader, and now I'm putting that buffered reader into a scanner object. So now I'm simply saying, while I have more integers, I'm going to read an integer and print it out. And to show you, I have a file set up called foo with 10, 20, and 30, and I am going to run it with foo as input. You see it prints 10, 20, 30. And I told you that if it doesn't exist, let's say we run it with the file bbz, there's no such file, so the virtual machine prints out Java not found file exception and where it occurred. And you can see up here, I actually declined to handle the IO exception. I said I was going to throw it, and that throws it up to the virtual machine. Okay, before we show you how to do FileIO using a buffered reader, we're going to just review how you do file output. Okay, so file output. And the big files for file output are going to be file writer and buffered writer and print writer. So file writer takes a file name, and if you want, you can also give it a second argument, which would be a Boolean, true, false, to indicate whether you're appending. So if you don't present that second argument, it creates a new file from scratch or overwrites any file that was previously there. Whereas if you add the second append and you say true, it will append output to it. Now again, you don't want to write directly to a file writer. That's inefficient. You want to drop it into a buffered writer so that it will buffer the output. And you can write lines at a time to a buffered writer if you wish, but typically you want to do formatted output. So typically you'll drop the buffered writer into a print writer, and that will allow you to use either printf or format to format output to your file. And the important methods for print writer are either format or printf. They're the same. And the close method, which you should again use as soon as you're done with a file, it will close the wrapped buffer writer and file writer as well. One issue you'll sometimes see with a print writer is it swallows exceptions. So it doesn't throw exceptions, it will silently set a flag. And you see some people don't like that. If you really don't like it, you'd have to use a buffered writer. A buffered writer will throw exceptions. You might say, then how could I format my output? Well, if you're going to use a buffered writer, let's go to the next thing. There are a few tricks with a buffered writer. So write will write a string. Close will close it. New line will write a new line character. So writes a new line character. And if you want to do formatted output, then you can use the string class. So you can, in that case, what you could do is something like this. You could say string, say line equals string dot format. Use the formatting commands to get a formatted line, and then you could just use whatever your buffered writer is. I'll pretend it's BW for buffered writer, and I'd then just say write line. So if you want to explicitly get your exceptions and you need to use a buffered writer, that's how you would do it. But the example that we're going to use is going to use a print writer. So let's take a look at that. We're going to have an example. It's just reading input from a file. The input consists of an age and either true, false. So we're guessing people's ages, and we are saying true, false, true if they guess the age correctly, false otherwise. So here's a sample file. So we guessed that person's age was 40, that was true. Guessed the person's age was 35, it was false. Guessed the person's age was 7, it was true. We want our output to look like this. So read in the age and correctness fields and then print them out. We're going to print them to an output file. And we're going to assume that the input file is on the command line, the output file is hard-coded. So we're going to use a scanner class, hence the import java.util.star, and the import java.io.star is for our IO classes. We remember to throw the IO exception up to main, and we are going to use a buffered reader called input reader. So now we're doing line-oriented IO, and the scanner object will be used for tokenizing each line. Here's our print writer, and here's our two fields for reading the age and whether the guess was correct. And this, ignore this one, this is a artifact that should have been deleted from the file. So the first thing I do, I create a new buffered reader by opening up a file reader and calling it data.txt. So I guess in fact I was actually hard coding data.txt as well. And then I created an output file by first creating a file writer, embedding it in a buffered writer, and embedding that in a print writer. Then I'm saying while my input is ready, so remember that the ready method returns false when it hits EOF, otherwise it returns true. I read a line and drop it into my scanner object, or a new scanner object. Then I know that there's two fields, one called age, which is an int, one called correctness guess, which is a Boolean. I'm not type checking them, I assume they're correct. Notice I make sure to get rid of my scanner by closing it, because I'm not using it again. And finally, I write my formatted output to my file using the format statement. And at the end of my program, even though it's not necessary, it is good policy. I close it. I really should have closed the input reader as well. That would have been good policy too. So that concludes FileIO. There are separate videotapes that talk about how to do console input and how to do console output.